The zip tie clicked around his wrists like punctuation at the end of a sentence that hadn't been written yet. Security Supervisor Dale Crenshaw thought he had finally caught himself a trespasser. He thought the man's expensive wool coat was stolen. He thought the keycard the man was carrying was forged. He thought he was doing his job. He was wrong, dead wrong. The man he had just shoved face first against the cold marble pillar of the Rideau Grand Hotel lobby wasn't a trespasser. He was Brigadier General Kofi Asante-Bowen, Deputy Commander of 2 Canadian Division, the highest-ranking logistics officer in the Canadian Army's Eastern Command. He was supposed to be upstairs in Suite 1402 in 40 minutes, briefing the Chief of the Defence Staff and 3 members of the Privy Council on a classified infrastructure assessment that covered every military installation from Halifax to Ottawa. Instead, he was on his knees on the lobby floor of a 5-star hotel, with his arms pinned behind his back, while a 26-year-old in a rented uniform called him a squatter. By the time the sun set over the Rideau Canal that evening, Dale Crenshaw's career wouldn't just be over. It would be dismantled brick by brick, and the foundation would crumble so completely that even the building that employed him would cease to exist in its current form. This is the story of what happens when arrogance mistakes composure for weakness. November in Ottawa has a particular kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. It comes off the river with intent, sharp enough to make your eyes water before you've taken 3 steps outside. Brigadier General Kofi Asante-Bowen had spent his career moving through climates that were actively trying to kill him. Kandahar in August, Yellowknife in February, a forward operating base in Mali, where the sand had opinions about your lungs. So the Ottawa cold was, to him, simply weather. He walked through it without ceremony, his cashmere overcoat buttoned precisely, his posture the kind that takes 30 years of service to build and about 8 seconds for civilians to misread as arrogance. He was 51 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples 2 winters ago, and he had not mourned it. His wife, Claire, had said the silver made him look distinguished. His daughter, Naomi, had said it made him look like a Bond villain. He had laughed at both of them. He was not in uniform. The briefing was classified. Arriving in dress blues at the Rideau Grand during a political conference would attract the kind of attention that compromised the nature of the meeting. Standard protocol for this level of operation was civilian dress and a cover identity. The hotel was booked under the name of the consulting firm that served as the CDS's administrative shell for off-site engagements. His orders were explicit: civilian clothes, discreet entrance, Suite 1402 by 5 o'clock. He arrived at 4:18:42 minutes early. Punctuality was not a habit for General Asante-Bowen. It was a religion. The lobby of the Rideau Grand was the kind of space that had been designed by someone who wanted you to feel like you had stumbled into a European banking institution. High ceilings, dark marble, brass fixtures polished to the point of self-congratulation. A chandelier hung above the entrance that Kofi suspected cost more than his first military posting had paid him in a year. The front desk was staffed by 2 young women in charcoal blazers who were currently occupied with a family checking in from Quebec City. Suitcases fanned out across the floor like a small expedition. Kofi crossed the lobby toward the elevator bank. He was carrying a slim leather attaché case and a keycard that had been couriered to his office that morning by the hotel's event security coordinator. He didn't make it to the elevator. Dale Crenshaw appeared from a door beside the concierge desk, with the speed of someone who had been watching and waiting. He was a stocky young man with the kind of confidence that comes not from competence but from the uniform and the 2-way radio clipped to his shoulder. He positioned himself directly in Kofi's path. "Sir." The word had no greeting in it. "Can I help you?" It was not a question. Kofi stopped. He looked at the man calmly. "I have a reservation. Name. The room is booked under Meridian Strategic Group, Suite 1402. Crenshaw's eyes moved slowly from Kofi's face to the attaché case, to the coat to the shoes, and back up again. It was the kind of visual inventory that tries to pass itself off as professionalism. It wasn't. "That suite is booked for a private government function," Crenshaw said. "Yes, I'm aware." "Then you'll understand why I'm asking for identification." Kofi reached into his inside coat pocket and produced his Department of National Defense security card. It was a federal government credential with a chip, a photograph, and a clearance level, indicated by a gold horizontal stripe that most civilians never encountered and therefore never recognized. Crenshaw looked at the card. He turned it over. He handed it back. This could be printed anywhere. The lobby, Kofi noted, had gone slightly quiet. The family at the front desk had stopped redistributing their suitcases. One of the charcoal blazer women behind the counter was watching. "I assure you it wasn't," Kofi said, his voice dropping half a register. It was the voice he used with contractors who submitted fraudulent bids. "I am expected upstairs. If you have concerns about my credentials, I'd suggest calling your event coordinator. Her name is Paulette." Crenshaw's jaw tightened. He hadn't liked the tone. Men who haven't earned authority rarely like it when they encounter the real thing. It reminds them of the distance. "Our event coordinator doesn't verify guests. That's security's job." He held out a hand. "Attaché case." "You do not have my consent to search that case," Kofi said, each word precise and unhurried. "It contains classified materials belonging to the federal government. If you touch it, without authorization you will be committing a federal offense under Section 46 of the Security of Information Act." Something shifted in Crenshaw's expression. It wasn't doubt. It wasn't recognition. It was the particular look of a man who has decided that backing down would be more expensive to his ego than pressing forward. He turned to the second security officer, who had materialized behind him, a younger man named Brett, according to the tag on his chest, and gave a small nod. "We're going to need you to come with us." "I will not," Kofi said simply. "Sir, I am telling you clearly and on the record," Kofi said, glancing at the security camera mounted above the elevator bank, "that I am here lawfully. I have a valid credential, and I am declining to be detained without cause. If you choose to proceed, the consequences of that decision will rest entirely with you." Crenshaw grabbed his arm. The lobby went entirely silent. In 31 years of military service, in conflict zones and parliamentary hearings, and situations that appeared in no training manual because they were too specific to be predicted, Kofi Asante Bowen had learned one thing above all others. The moment you lose your composure is the moment you lose the room. He did not lose his composure. He did not raise his voice. He did not pull against the grip. He simply said, with the quiet authority of a man who has briefed prime ministers, "You are making a very serious mistake." Crenshaw didn't hear it as a warning. He heard it as a threat. He pulled Kofi's arms behind his back with the kind of exaggerated force that announces itself to everyone watching, and zip-tied his wrists with a sharp plastic click. Brett, to his partial credit, looked uncomfortable. He looked at Crenshaw. "You sure about this, Dale?" "Suite 1402 is off-limits to unauthorized personnel," Crenshaw said, loudly enough that the sound carried to the front desk. "Take him to the security office." The security office was a windowless room behind the kitchen corridor that smelled of instant coffee and printer toner. There was a folding table, a monitor showing 16 different camera angles, and a chair with a wobble in the left rear leg. Kofi sat in it. He did not fidget. Crenshaw stood across the table with his arms folded. "Someone will come verify your story." "Sit tight. I would like to use my phone," Kofi said. "You'll wait. I have a briefing in." He checked his watch without moving his wrists, an accomplishment that required certain experience. 34 minutes. "If I am not in that room, the individuals waiting for me will initiate a welfare check through RCMP channels. I would prefer to avoid that. I'm giving you the opportunity to correct this before it becomes irreversible." Crenshaw leaned against the doorframe and said nothing. Kofi looked at Brett, who was standing near the monitor. "You," he said. "There is a keycard in my left coat pocket. Remove it and look at the back." Brett hesitated. He looked at Crenshaw. Crenshaw shrugged, as if to say, "Go ahead," entertained the man. Brett reached into Kofi's pocket and pulled out the keycard. He flipped it over. On the back, in small but readable print, was the Meridian Strategic Group logo, a federal government crown watermark, and a 6-digit authorization code. Brett's face changed. Crenshaw's didn't. "Could be anything." "Call the number on the back," Kofi said. "Ask for the event security coordinator. Her extension is 7 Alpha. Tell her that General Asante Bowen is in your security office." Silence. "Go ahead," Kofi said. "I'll wait." Crenshaw didn't move for 8 seconds. Then, with the body language of a man performing a favor rather than following a reasonable instruction, he picked up the desk phone and dialed. It rang twice. The voice that answered was not the event security coordinator's. It was the chief of the defense staff. General Walter Drummond had been in the suite when the call was automatically redirected, a precaution that had been built into the communications protocol for exactly this kind of emergency. His voice, when it came through the speaker, was the kind of calm that sounds like the eye of a hurricane rather than the absence of one. "Who is this?" Crenshaw opened his mouth, closed it. "This is security, sir. Rideau Grand Hotel. We have a man claiming, 'Where is General Asante Bowen?'" The silence in the room changed texture. He's here, sir, in our security." "Put him on." Crenshaw's hand shook slightly as he held the phone out across the table. Kofi took it in his zip-tied hands with a steadiness that cost him nothing. "General Drummond, my apologies for the disruption. I am in the hotel security office. I've been detained by a supervisor who was unconvinced by my credentials. I'm uninjured. I'll need approximately 3 minutes to be upstairs." There was a pause. "You'll be there in 2, General Drummond said. And then, at a volume that Kofi held the phone slightly away from his ear to allow Crenshaw to hear clearly, "Get me the hotel manager, and get me the security director of whatever firm contracted these people. And somebody get me a lawyer, because I want to know what federal charges apply when someone zip-ties a brigadier general." The phone was returned to the desk. The room was very quiet. Brett cut the zip-tie without being asked. The hotel manager arrived in 4 minutes. His name was Theodore Garneau, a compact man in his mid-50s, who had managed the Rideau Grand for 11 years, and who, upon entering the security office and seeing Brigadier General Kofi Asante Bowen sitting at a folding table, rubbing the red marks on his wrists, went the color of old paper. "General," Garneau said. I cannot begin, Mr. Garneau." Kofi stood. He was a full head taller than the manager. "My briefing starts in 7 minutes. We will have this conversation afterward." He walked out of the security office, through the kitchen corridor, and into the lobby. He crossed the marble floor to the elevator bank, pressed the button. The doors opened immediately. He stepped in, turned, and stood with his hands folded in front of him as the doors slid shut. In the lobby behind him, Dale Crenshaw stood very still. Brett looked at him. "Dale." "Shut up," Crenshaw said. The briefing in Suite 1402 lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. It covered the Eastern Seaboard Infrastructure Assessment, 3 contingency scenarios for rapid response deployment, and a procurement analysis that had been 18 months in preparation. Kofi presented the logistics data with the precision of someone who had been doing this since before some of the junior staff in the room had started high school. Afterward, General Drummond asked everyone else to leave. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the service trolley and set one in front of Kofi. "Tell me what happened." Kofi told him, precisely, without embellishment. He described the interaction in the lobby, the failure of his credential to satisfy the security officer, the zip tie, the phone call. He spoke the way he wrote operational reports, factually, chronologically, without editorial, except where editorial was warranted. General Drummond listened. He drank his coffee. When Kofi was finished, Drummond set his cup down. "What do you want?" It was a question Kofi had been asked before, in different rooms, by different people, with different levels of power to act on the answer. He had learned to take the question seriously, because the answer mattered more than the asking. "I want it on record," Kofi said. "Not for me. Because the next person who gets zip-tied in that lobby won't have a direct line to your office. And they deserve to know that the record exists." Drummond nodded slowly. "I'll make the call tonight." He made 4 calls, 1 to the RCMP's Federal Investigations Unit, 1 to the Office of the Minister of Public Safety, 1 to the law firm retained by the Department of National Defense, 1 to the president of the security contracting company, whose employees staffed the Rideau Grand, a company that held, Drummond confirmed during that call, over $6 million in federal government contracts. The last call lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the contracting company's president called the Rideau Grand's general manager. That call lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, Dale Crenshaw was escorted off the premises by 2 of his own colleagues, which is a particular kind of humiliation that hotel lobbies witness more often than they admit. The investigation that followed was not quiet, and it was not quick. The RCMP federal unit opened a file the next morning. They pulled all security footage from the lobby and the corridor. 8 camera angles, covering the full 34 minutes from the moment Kofi entered the building to the moment he stepped into the elevator. The footage was unambiguous. Kofi had presented his credential. Kofi had identified himself. Kofi had stated clearly and calmly that the attaché case contained classified materials. Kofi had offered the telephone contact. At no point had he raised his voice. At no point had he made any movement that could be interpreted as threatening. At several points, he could be seen narrating his own actions for the benefit of the cameras, a protocol investigators would later learn that he had developed during his time advising on de-escalation training for military police, and one that he had quietly taught to his 3 children years earlier. The footage also showed Crenshaw grabbing his arm and applying the zip tie. That footage was requested by 4 national media outlets within 48 hours of the incident, after a hotel employee who had witnessed the lobby interaction posted a brief account on social media that was shared 12,000 times before noon. The comment that spread fastest was not the most detailed or the most eloquent. It was 4 words from a retired warrant officer in New Brunswick. They zip-tied a general. The federal investigation expanded quickly, as federal investigations tend to do when the initial thread is pulled and the fabric turns out to be looser than anyone expected. The security contracting firm, formerly registered as Garrison Security Partners Limited, had held contracts with 11 federal government facilities across Ontario and Quebec. Investigators reviewing those contracts found a pattern of complaints that had been filed and then quietly closed. 6 complaints in the previous 3 years. 3 involved black professionals who had been detained or turned away from facilities they had legitimate access to. 2 of those individuals had filed formal grievances. Both grievances had been resolved through private settlement agreements that included non-disclosure clauses. The 7th complaint, as of the date Kofi was zip-tied in the lobby of the Rideau Grand, was his. He did not sign a non-disclosure agreement. He had never intended to. At the press conference held outside RCMP headquarters, 3 weeks after the incident, 4 medals on his chest, 3 stars on his shoulder, posture that had not moved in 31 years, and read a statement. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anger. He spoke with the tone of a man who has been waiting for the right room, in front of the right people, to say a thing that needed saying. "I want to be precise about what happened," he said. "I was not stopped because I looked dangerous. I was not stopped because I behaved suspiciously. I was stopped because someone looked at me and decided, before I had spoken a word, that I did not belong in that lobby. That decision has a name, and I am not going to use the polite word for it today." He paused. The cameras held. "I have served this country for 31 years. I have deployed to 3 continents. I have buried colleagues whose names are on monuments. I wore civilian clothes into that hotel because my orders required discretion, and I was still not extended the basic courtesy that would have been extended to someone who looked different than I do. That is not a personal grievance. That is a failure of a system that we have been asked to report and then asked to be quiet about. I am done being quiet." The clip was played on CBC that evening. It was played on CTV, on Global, on 3 francophone networks. By the following morning, it had been viewed over 2 million times. By the end of the week, it was in the parliamentary record, entered by a member from Hamilton, who read the transcript into Hansard during question period. The proceedings against Garrison Security Partners were not a trial, they were a reckoning. The federal contracts were suspended within 10 days of the investigation's formal opening. The company contested the suspension through its legal representatives, arguing insufficient cause and procedural error. The RCMP responded by releasing the footage of the lobby incident to the public record, all 34 minutes unedited. The legal contest was quietly withdrawn the following Tuesday. Garrison Security Partners Limited lost all federal contracts. The license to operate in federal facilities was revoked. The company filed for creditor protection 4 months later. Dale Crenshaw was charged under Section 279 of the Criminal Code with unlawful confinement. He was also named in a civil suit filed on behalf of 3 of the 6 individuals who had previously been detained or denied access to government facilities under Garrison's watch. 2 of those individuals had reached private settlements that were now under review. Those settlements were voided by court order when it was demonstrated that the company had misrepresented the nature of the complaints in the original grievance process. Crenshaw's trial was held in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. He pleaded not guilty. His defence argued that the response to the incident had been disproportionate. A word his lawyer used 6 times in the opening statement, and which the Crown prosecutor addressed directly in her reply. "The defence has used the word disproportionate to describe the legal consequences of this incident," she said, standing very still in front of the jury. "I'd like to suggest that the disproportionate thing in this case was zip-tying the wrists of a senior federal officer in a public hotel lobby, because his credentials didn't look the way the defendant expected them to look. Everything that followed was consequence, not proportion. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Crenshaw was convicted. He was sentenced to 14 months, suspended, with 2 years probation, a permanent prohibition from working in any security or law enforcement capacity, and mandatory participation in a human rights education program developed in partnership with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Brett, who had applied the keycard and whose discomfort had been visible enough on camera to register with the Crown's legal team, cooperated fully with the investigation. He was not charged. He lost his job. He enrolled, on his own initiative, in a social services program in Sudbury. That detail was not reported by any major outlet. It was the kind of detail that doesn't fit neatly into the shape of the story everyone wants to tell. Kofi didn't watch the sentencing from the courtroom. He was in Petawawa that day, overseeing a logistics exercise with the 3rd Canadian Division. He heard the verdict by phone from his legal counsel while standing outside a field tent in November cold that was making his breath visible. "Thank you," he said, and hung up. He went back into the tent. His aide, a young captain named Warren from Fredericton, who had been with him for 18 months, looked up from the deployment maps. "Good news, sir." "Adequate news," Kofi said. "Let's continue." The amendments to Canada's security clearance and access protocols that were tabled in Parliament the following March included a provision that had not existed before, a mandatory, independent review process for any security-related detention of a federal credential holder with a fixed 48-hour window for escalation to the RCMP. The provision was sponsored by a cross-party coalition of MPs. It was referred to informally, in committee discussions and corridor conversations, as the Asante provision. Kofi was told about the informal name by a parliamentary aide who emailed him in April. He read the email twice. He wrote back a single line: "Please ensure it applies equally to every credential holder, not only those with stars on their shoulders. That is the only version of this worth passing." The aide forwarded the response to the committee chair. The language of the provision was amended to include explicit protections for all federal credential classes, from senior officers to cleaning staff who carried federal access cards. The provision passed with unanimous consent. Garrison Security Partners was dissolved entirely by the end of that fiscal year. The Rideau Grand Hotel underwent a complete internal audit and parted ways with the third-party security framework that had allowed a subcontracted firm to make arrest decisions without direct hotel authorization. Theodore Garneau issued a public apology that was 400 words long and notable for the fact that he appeared to mean it. He commissioned a plaque, quietly, without announcement that was installed in the hotel's internal training room. It read simply, "A credential is not enough. Ask what you're really looking at." Whether that instruction would be heeded by the people who read it was a question the plaque could not answer. Some things change slowly. Some things change only when someone decides that the cost of not changing is finally too high. General Kofi Asante Bowen was promoted to Major General 14 months after that Tuesday afternoon in November. His promotion ceremony was held at CFB Kingston. His wife Claire stood in the front row. His daughter Naomi, who had flown in from Vancouver, stood beside her. At the moment the 4th star was pinned to his shoulder, she leaned over to her mother and whispered something. Claire smiled. Later, at the reception, Kofi asked Naomi what she'd said. She shrugged. "I said you still kind of look like a Bond villain." He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that only comes after something has been survived, earned, and filed away as one more chapter in a story that is still being written. He drove home that night with the window down despite the cold. The Ottawa River was dark and still, and the lights of the city reflected on it, in long broken lines that shifted when the wind moved. He thought about the lobby, the marble floor, the zip tie clicking shut. He thought about the moment he had looked at the security camera above the elevator bank, not to threaten, not to perform, but to document. A survival tactic, the same one he had taught his children. He thought about who else had been in that hotel that week. The family checking in from Quebec City. The woman behind the front desk who had watched without intervening, and whose expression, on the recovered footage, had told its own story. He thought about the 6 complaints that had been filed and quietly buried. He thought about the 2 people who who had signed agreements and gone home carrying something they were not allowed to name. He hoped, in the way that soldiers hope for things they cannot control, that the provision would be enough, that the name attached to it would mean something, not because it was his name, but because it was attached to a principle that should have required no name at all. He hoped that the next person who walked into a lobby with a government credential and was met with a look that said, "You don't belong here," would have somewhere to go, someone to call, a system that would answer. That was the work. The real work, the kind that doesn't fit on a plaque or in a headline, the kind that happens in committees and classrooms and quiet conversations between people who have decided that being quiet was no longer an option. Kofi Asante-Bowen drove on through the November dark, and the city moved past him, and the river kept its own counsel. Dale Crenshaw thought he was doing his job. He thought the coat was stolen. He thought the credential was fake. He thought the kind of man he was looking at didn't belong in that lobby. He was wrong about every single thing, and the cost of being wrong, when you are wrong in that particular direction, about that particular kind of assumption, that cost isn't personal, it compounds. It falls on everyone who came before and was never believed, and on everyone who will come after and deserves better. That is what justice looks like when it finally arrives. Not loud, not triumphant, just the steady, inevitable weight of a truth that refused to be zip-tied and driven to a back office and told to wait. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit like so more stories like this can reach the people who are still waiting for the system to answer when they call. And subscribe to Voices of Courage, because these stories exist, and they deserve to be told.